Hi, I'm Constance Duke, Director of Sustainability at Sustain.Life. This is the Week in Sustainability, where a team of practitioners get together to share some of the most important issues and stories in sustainability this week. I'm joined today by my colleague, Hannah Isowski, our sustainability data analyst, and we want to talk about the revision of an EU law that increases the 2030 emissions reduction target at the EU level from 30 to 40%, and renewables hitting a new record in grid share in 2022. So I'll start us off with the revision of the so-called EU Effort Sharing Regulation, or ESR, which has been formalized on Tuesday of this week to reduce member state emissions by 2030, even more so than originally committed to. So this revision was approved by an overwhelming majority in the European Parliament, and this is actually the first time that EU member states are subject to binding targets. The ESR impacts emissions from things like road transport, heating of buildings, agriculture, waste management, and small industrial installation in member states. Each member state has a specific target, and those targets are based on GDP and cost effectiveness, and member states also have an annual emissions ceiling. The latest version of the ESR also limits the use of emissions trading schemes, as well as dipping into emission savings from prior years or borrowing allowances against future years. So essentially closing several loopholes and forcing real reduction efforts. For some member states, this revision results in significant changes. For example, Ireland previously needed to reduce emissions across transport, agriculture, and buildings by 30% compared to 2005, but is now looking at a 42% reduction. And then Germany and Sweden, among some other countries, now are looking at cutting their emissions in half. But, the ESR is part of the EU's Fit for 55 plan, which is the strategy that calls for a minimum 55% emissions reduction by 2030 over 1990 levels, which does align with the European Green Deal and, of course, also supports the European climate law. It so happens that on the same day, the EU Parliament also voted in favor of new rules on land use change, and forestry, which is essentially increasing targets for carbon sinks and biodiversity to put the EU on track to become climate neutral by 2050. So overall, this is all very promising. Even, recently enacted legislation is already up for revision to keep member states on track to achieve or even exceed the emissions reduction targets that the EU has committed to. And with that, I am handing it off to Hannah to talk about renewables in the grid in 2022. Take it away, Hannah.
Yeah. So Bloomberg and the Business Council for Sustainable Energy came out with their Sustainable Energy Factbook last week. It contains some great takeaways as to how the grid mix changed in 2022, as well as some really optimistic predictions of what we can expect to see from the grid in 2023. We've already talked in prior weeks about the 2022 grid mix, so I'll only summarize it really briefly. Coal continued to decrease, and we can expect that to stay the case in 2023. Nuclear also decreased as a result of some older technologies being taken out of commission. And then we saw natural gas and renewables both bump up their share of their position in the grid mix. While natural gas's consistent growth is bad news, the good news is that renewables are growing way faster. We saw a 12% year-on-year rise of renewable power generation between 21 and 22, even with supply chain interruptions that held deployment back. However, the part of the fact book that I really enjoyed was the forward-looking analysis, and this is where I really sort of saw the work being done in 2022 that sets us up to continue breaking records in 2023. So rather than just looking at the mix of electricity generated in 2022, the Factbook shares the composition of new power generation and new power storage built in 2022. The US added 40 gigawatts of capacity, and only 6 of those gigawatts were natural gas. So that represents a really huge new low for natural gas within the last 20 years. And it's upsetting that natural gas is still sort of a huge share of the grid mix, but I feel like it's uplifting to see that infrastructurally, we're not preparing for that to remain the case. Even more uplifting is that 32 gigawatts out of that 40 new built capacity is renewable power generation. So most of these projects are wind and solar was held back in a really huge way in 2022 due to some supply chain interactions. But representatives of the solar industry say that they can expect those obstacles to ease in 2023, and they'll be back on the pace of really historic growth. And that's, I think, on a really sort of high level, we know that this decarbonization process and decarbonizing the grid is a massive construction undertaking. And I think this report really highlights that we're doing that work. We're prioritizing and favoring renewables of the future. I think it's really uplifting.
Thank you, Hannah. It's great to hear about this ramping up of renewables. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. We will see you next week for more stories in sustainability. Until then, take care.